My name is Toyotomi Morimoto, and I'm a professor of migration studies at Waseda University. I appreciate Dr. Ueda, the Hoover Institution, and Nihon Imin Gakkai for allowing me to join this wonderful, talented, and promising group of young scholars as a discussant. Professor Alice Chen of Boston University will join us online later as another discussant. Let me briefly introduce three presenters in session 2. The first presenter is Yi-Ting Chung, born and raised in Taiwan. Her current research interests lies in the colonial subjects of Japanese Empire, Okinawans, Koreans, and Taiwanese. Today, she focuses on the Taiwanese diaspora in the US during the war. The next presenter is Kimihiko Nakamura, a doctor's candidate in East Asian art history at Heidelberg University, Germany. His research interests are modern Japanese, Asian diasporic, and Asian American art. Today, he talks about the troubled trajectory of Kawabata Minoru as a war painter in Imperial Japan during the war and a diasporic painter in the post-war period. The third presenter is Mutiara, an independent researcher in the sociology and anthropology of migration. She has conducted sensory ethnography of offspring of Japanese migrants in North Sulawesi, Indonesia, who are now living in Owarai, Ibaraki Prefecture. Today's topic concerns her ethnographic study of the intergenerational stories of these migrants. So without further ado, Yi-Ting Chen, please present your paper.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. So my presentation topic today is Taiwanese diaspora in the US during World War II. This is part of my larger dissertation project, which aims to explore the social history of mobile colonial migrants traversing the Pacific to US from the Japanese colonies. So that includes Okinawans, Koreans, and Taiwanese migrants. But for today's presentation, I will be only focusing on the case of Taiwanese, particularly through the lens of an individual named Yi-Ting. So as you have probably observed, here are some snapshots of key moments of Yi-Ting's life. However, before I delve into the details of Yi-Ting's life and provide larger social and historical contextualization, I wanted to first offer a justification of why Yi-Ting was selected as a case study. So it was not only because the Tsai and Morikawa family generously made their family collection public, but also because when I was reading the documents and letters left by Yi-Ting, I realized that at some point during World War II, he was asking the exact same question that I was asking when I started all this research, which could be best illustrated in a petition that he sent to the Secretary of State in 1945, which he wrote, "Dear Sir, what is the attitude of the United States government toward Chinese Formosians living in this country? That is, does the United States government consider Chinese Formosians as friendly aliens as the Koreans in this country are considered?" And here's my research question for this presentation. Were US Taiwanese migrants Japanese, Chinese, or entirely something else during World War II? And it can be further break down into two other details questions as how did Taiwanese migrants at the time identify themselves? And what was their legal status in wartime US? And for my larger dissertation project, the ultimate research question is how the transborder, transpacific, and trans-imperial experiences of colonial migrants can challenge first, the boundaries of the Japanese nation empire, and second, the epistemic category of the Japanese American or Japanese diaspora, right? So when we're talking about Japanese diaspora, how often do we have colonial migrants' experiences in mind? So it's part of the goal of this presentation to showcase that studying the experiences of colonial migrants, as Professor Koikari has talked about in her talk, that can really unravel a fascinating page of history that is largely invisible if you don't have the colonies in mind. So I will first give an overview of the situation of Taiwanese migrants before World War II. So I think this is where it merits a comparison with the Korean and Okinawan migrants. So as you can see in this chart, there's a huge numerical gap between Taiwanese migrants and the two other groups. There are only 40 to 50 Taiwanese migrants, and the number is not even at the point of 90s, 30s. It was the total number of entire Taiwanese migrants that was present in the US before 1945. What's more, their social backgrounds also drastically different. So the bulk of Okinawan and Korean migrants were laborers, many of whom toiled on the sugar plantation in Hawaii. While in the case of Taiwanese migrants, most of them were students, who were pursuing higher education in the States. And unlike some Okinawan and Korean migrants who stayed in the US and established families, most of the Taiwanese migrants who came returned immediately upon graduation. So how do we explain this numerical gap and different patterns of migration? One way of explanation is by looking at different migration policy that was applied to these three groups. So for the case of Okinawan migrants and Korean migrants, as you can see, most migration policy that was applied on Japanese migrants also applied to these two groups, including the 1907 Gentleman Agreement and 1924 Immigration Act. On top of that, as you can see, after Japan became a protectorate of Korea in 1905, the Japanese government also suspended the Korean migration to Hawaii. However, in the case of Taiwanese migrants, before the application of Gentleman Agreement, there was another act that was applied to them, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882. And just 2 years after, in 1884, actually the US Congress passed an amendment bill stipulating that the Chinese Exclusion Act now applied to all Chinese subjects, not only of China, but of all other foreign countries, meaning that now the logic of exclusion for Chinese Exclusion Act was not based on nationality, but instead based on race and ethnicity. So by extension, that means that even when Taiwan became a colony of Japan after 1895, Taiwanese migrants were still subjected to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for example, according to a travelogue of a Taiwanese student coming to San Francisco for study, he mentioned that at the checkpoint in San Francisco, likely Angel Island, that he was instructed to join the line of Chinese migrants instead of the Japanese migrants. And on the visa document that was issued by the US consulate in Japan, it categorized him as ethnic Chinese with Japanese nationality. So that was, so by the nature of that, the only Taiwanese migrants that were allowed to enter US after Chinese Exclusion Act were officials, students, teachers, merchants, and travelers of pleasure and curiosity. Another act that was applied to Taiwanese migrants, interestingly, was the 1943 Magnuson Act, which was also known as the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act, which was enacted after US became an ally with China in World War II. So under the Magnuson Act, it stipulated that Chinese subjects residing in the US now became eligible for naturalization to US citizenship. So here again, the legal definition of Chinese subject is the same as the Chinese Exclusion Act, meaning that it's not defined by nationality, but defined by race and ethnicity. So again, by extension here, Taiwanese migrants during this time, during World War II, although of Japanese nationality, were theoretically able to be naturalized as US citizen under the Magnuson Act. And we will come back to this point with a case study later. Okay, I don't have time to go through this. Okay, so now for us to understand the social and legal condition of Taiwanese diaspora during World War II, I would like to introduce to you the story of Yi-Ting. So Yi-Ting was born in a wealthy Taiwanese Christian family in Tainan, southern Taiwan. And as you can probably guess, not many Taiwanese families during that time could afford a second, two-floor Western building in a countryside, and this was their family home. And most of the Thai family siblings went study abroad, mostly in Japan or in China. So ranked 8th, however, Tsai was actually the first among his siblings to study abroad in the US. So before he came to the US, he actually spent almost a decade in Doshisha and eventually getting a degree in theological school before he continued his study in at the Divinity School of University of Chicago. And it was on the Chicago campus that he met another fellow Taiwanese named Chung. So Chung later would reappear multiple times in and Yi-Ting Tsai's writing, as Yi-Ting Tsai often referred to Chung as the only other fellow Taiwanese that was present in the US during World War II. However, that was not exactly correct because there were also other Taiwanese present during World War II. I don't have time to go through their backgrounds, but I do want to linger on the story of Chung. So Chung also came from a Taiwanese Christian family who also went to Doshisha University, came to the US actually 6 years earlier than Yi-Ting Tsai in 1932, studying chemistry. And after Pearl Harbor, he was drafted into the US Army, serving as an interpreter in the prisoner of war processing, first at Michigan, and a year later transferred to New Caledonia. And it was when he was serving in New Caledonia in 1944, he naturalized as a US citizen under the Magnuson Act. So this experience is important later on as a reference, as a comparison point when we are talking about Yi-Ting Tsai's experience during World War II, trying to alter his legal status. So now, coming back to the story of Yi-Ting Tsai, when he first arrived in Chicago in 1938. When he first arrived, he was contacted by the Japanese Christian community there to be serving as their minister. The congregation was relatively small. It was around 12 to 16 people. And after Pearl Harbor, Yi-Ting Tsai actually became the key person to single-handedly revive this church. So after Pearl Harbor, FBI actually suspended any gathering of this Japanese Christian community. So Yi-Ting Tsai leveraged his connections through Chicago, mainly through his Chicago professor, Arthur Palmer, to negotiate with local Chicago police so that the Japanese Christian community can resume their church service. And on top of that, he even helped this community to secure a church space for regular gatherings at the Fourth Presbyterian Church. So the Japanese who attended this church at that time included Japanese-American photographer Harry Shigeta, also Uratani Michizo, who was born from Shiga, was Yi-Ting Tsai's classmate in Doshisha. And this picture, he was standing beside William Boris, who was the founder of Omi Mission. Uratani Michizo would later be incarcerated around 1944 for being accused of spreading nationalistic thoughts and support of Japanese victory for World War II in this church. Another person present at this church was Reverend Sumio Koga, born in Oakland. Sumio Koga was incarcerated in 1942 at Lake Tule before he came to Chicago. So that's here a short clip from Sumio Koga himself reflecting on his experience in the Chicago church.
Because the war came and they already had an original Japanese group there in Chicago, which was closed by the authority. And no meeting was allowed for Japanese. So their church was closed. But this group pleaded and wanted to have a place to meet, and asked Yi-Ting Tsai, Reverend Yi-Ting Tsai, who was now a minister in Seattle, by the way, Congregation Church, asked him, who was still a student, and can you find a place for us to meet? Of course, Yi-Ting Tsai being a student at the Chicago Theological Divinity School, he said he asked his president, Palmer, and Palmer says, "Oh, you could always use our chapel again, But as you know, the University of Chicago is way down south, and Japanese live in the north side. And he said, that's too far to travel for us. So can we find anything nearby? So Dr. Palmer recommended Yi-Ting Tsai and the group to go to Fourth Presbyterian Church, which is the center of the city.
What's his name?
Yi-Ting Tsai. Tsai is T-S-A-I. Tsai. Tsai.
What kind of name?
He's a Taiwanese. Taiwanese. See? He was studying, he graduated Doshisha, and then, he was studying.
He was a pastor over there?
He was, helping the group.
Oh, I see.
See, he wasn't ordained or anything yet, see?
But he was having this Japanese group.
Yeah, he was having this.
Yi-Ting Tsai, what kind of name was that? So as you can see, the interviewer was very confused. He was a Japanese pastor, he was a Taiwanese pastor helping out the Japanese community. So actually, Yi-Ting Tsai, a lot happened to Yi-Ting Tsai later on in 1942, where he was ordained in Chicago later that year. So the war actually touched upon Yi-Ting Tsai's life more than one way. So before Pearl Harbor, he was actually in the process of accepting a marriage arranged by his family in Taiwan. However, this marriage discussion kind of quieted down after Pearl Harbor, presumably because he was very overwhelmingly occupied by his responsibility for the Japanese Christian community, but also because he met someone else. So
Because
allow
the
me
war
to
came and
introduce,
they already had
I'm sorry,
original-
Ryo Morikawa, born and raised in San Diego. So Ryo Morikawa, the Morikawa family traveled to Texas after the issue of Japanese evacuation order in 1942, which displaced many Japanese families on the West Coast. So the Morikawa first traveled to Wichita Falls, Texas. However, the eldest son, George, was an engineer and he wasn't able to find any job opportunities in Texas. And that's when he brought Ryo together with him to Chicago. And as more and more Japanese families were displaced from West Coast, many of them decided to relocate eastward to Midwestern cities like Chicago. And Yi-Ting seized upon this opportunity to expand his church. And this was how a Japanese American woman recently uprooted from her hometown met a Taiwanese pastor who was seeking to grow his congregation. The two were married on the Christmas Eve of 1942. And this photo on the very left was George, Ryo's eldest brother, and then Ryo's mother. And then right beside Ryo was her sister, Anna. So actually through the introduction of Yi-Ting, Anna Morikawa would later marry to Chung, if you remember. So Chung would actually later become Yi-Ting's brother-in-law. And the person right beside Yi-Ting is Uratani Michizo. So, okay. Until this point of Yi-Ting's life, it seems like he encountered very little obstacle in terms of that his Taiwanese background, his background as a colonial migrant seems to pose very little obstacle for him to be accepted to the Japanese community. Not only was he accepted, he was actually a community leader of the Japanese Christian community there, and he married a Japanese American woman. However, his quest to be recognized as Taiwanese, as a Chinese Formosan, will prove to be much more tumultuous. So he actually tried twice to repeal his status as an enemy alien, the first time right after his marriage through Albert Palmer. However, in the middle of that process, he actually withdrew his request as another of his mentor in Chicago, Robert Cashman, advised him that any change of his Japanese citizenship might result in retaliation on his family and against his family in Taiwan. So that's why he just withdrew it. However, he actually reopened the case to change his status as enemy alien again in 1945. And at this time, this was because he became much more committed in serving for the US military cause for victory of World War II. So in 1944, Yi-Ting actually left his position as the pastor to serve in the US Navy Military Government Research Unit in Columbia University, directly under the supervision of George Kerr, who was a US diplomat and a Taiwanese expert serving for the War Department. So what was Yi-Ting working on when he was a translator and research analyst in Columbia University? So from George Kerr's post-war publication Formosa Betrayed, we now know that what they were working on in Colombia during that time was something called Operation Causeway, which was a US Navy plan to invade Taiwan during World War II. So the operation was not eventually carried out. However, in the summer of 1944, the Navy and Admiral Chester Nimitz was actually very passionate and invested in this project. However, at the end of the summer of 1944, as Japan took over southern China, invading Taiwan became both logistically challenging and strategically undesirable. And that's when both Nimitz and MacArthur decided to bypass Taiwan and started preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. However, the information that was produced in Colombia for Operation Causeway proved to be useful for other wartime efforts. For example, towards the end of the war, Taiwan was under constant air raids. And here is an example of an aerial photo of an air raid on the city of Tainan, which was Yi-Ting's hometown. So it's a difficult question to ask, what was Yi-Ting's motivation in joining the Operation Causeway and essentially become the only Taiwanese people who was offering knowledge and his linguistic skills to US plan to basically invade his hometown. And I don't think I have enough time to do justice to this discussion, but if people are interested, feel free to ask me in the later QA sessions. So what happened to IT's after the Operation Causeway was as the Operation Causeway urgency dwindled at the end of 1944, IT's was released from his position in Columbia University and immediately provided an offer from War Department. However, just first day into his work in the War Department realized that they actually made a mistake of not realizing IT's legal status enemy alien. So they realized that they didn't run the proper background check on Ai-Ji-Tsai. So this was when Ai-Ji-Tsai became very committed in changing his legal status as enemy alien. And this time, not only Ai-Ji-Tsai, he had an entire army behind him who was convinced that Ai-Ji-Tsai's trilingual skills and his knowledge of East Asia would prove of great strategic value to US war, also wanted to persuade US agencies to remove his alien status. So whenever he's sending these petition letters, he always has vouching letters from War Department staff, George Kerr, and his professors from Chicago University as well. So for example, in 1945, he wrote a petition letter to President Roosevelt. And this was the petition letter I showed at the beginning of this presentation to the Secretary of State. So what was the government response? So the Department of State responded Ai-Ji-Tsai saying, well, although the question of the position of Chinese Formosan living in the United States has not arisen, meaning that we didn't actually start thinking about this question until you ask us, it would seem safe to assume that such matters will be considered by this government in a spirit of sympathetic friendliness. This was because this is after the Cairo Declaration, which stipulated that Taiwan will be returned to the jurisdiction of Republic of China after the war. So that's why the Department of State was saying that we should expect a sympathetic friendliness. However, they don't really know how to respond to Ai-Ji-Tsai's request to repeal his enemy alien status. So they said, well, refer him to the DOJ. And the DOJ said, well, we don't know that as well, so ask INS. However, they came back with a very interesting comment saying that Koreans were exempted from the classification of the enemy alien due to the existence of a considerable group of anti-Japanese Koreans. However, that was not the case for Taiwanese. Therefore, Taiwanese in the US were not exempted from the classification of the enemy alien status like Koreans. Okay, so the end of the story is kind of anticlimax because INS simply said, no, we do not accept this appeal. So my conclusion here is that collectively, both Ai-Ji-Tsai and Kim-Il-sung's experience of altering their legal status or clarifying their legal status during World War II really showcase the liminality of Taiwanese diasporas as ethnic Chinese with Japanese nationality. They were both Chinese allies, but at the same time, Japanese enemy alien. They were Chinese enough to be eligible for naturalization, but not anti-Japanese enough to be considered as friend alien. So my argument here is really that the Taiwanese experience really demonstrated how not only the inconsistency of US categorization, but the agencies of these colonial migrants being able to navigate under precarious conditions of social and legal uncertainties during war. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
As Professor Morimoto gave a kind of introduction, my presentation focused on one Japanese painter, Kawabata Minoru, who produced war propaganda paintings in wartime. And then he established himself as abstract painter in post-war New York. Despite the rise and the fall of world powers in the Asian Pacific American region throughout the 20th century, Kawabata Minoru established himself as a painter by repeatedly changing his location's identity and painting styles. By situating Kawabata's practice in his trans-war historical and socio-political context, roughly from the 1920s to the 60s, this paper considers how the Japanese Empire and the post-war American hegemony were entangled within the visual field. This entanglement has been largely overlooked by conventional post-war Japanese art historiography, which has tended both to uphold a nation-based narrative and to regard 1945 as a fresh start. Since Kawabata was one of the foremost male painters in the Transpacific region across the trans-war period, he will provide a unique lens for delineating how at this time social and political milieus in art making were transposed from the setting of Imperial Japan into the new cultural context of America as an ascendant superpower. In the interwar period, many ambitious young Japanese painters traveled to Paris to study art at art schools and present their works at salons until the invasion of France by the Nazi Germany in 1940. Among the young Japanese painters making their way to France was Kawabata. Kawabata had the privilege of elite education in yoga, as Western-style oil painting was then known. Born into a distinguished artistic family, his grandfather was Kawabata Gyokusho, a master painter of the Mariam School, and his father, Kawabata Mosho, was also a painter. After studying under the respected Paris-trained yoga painter Fujishima Takeji at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, Kawabata moved to Paris in August 1939. Shortly afterwards, France declared war on Nazi Germany, and Kawabata was ordered to leave the country, boarded a ship from Bordeaux to return to Japan. Nevertheless, Kawabata would not give up his dream to study in Paris, so he left the ship in New York, where he stayed for 3 months before returning at last to Paris. When the war quickly escalated, Kawabata fled to Rome, but soon fascist Italy also joined the conflict, and he reluctantly returned to Japan from the Gulf of Naples in September 1940. These itineraries are often mentioned in existing literature, but the Hoover Institution's Hoji Shimbun digital collection tells us an unfamiliar story. According to the Honolulu-based Japanese English language newspaper, Nippujiji, Kawabata stayed in Honolulu between August 29 and November 19th in 1935. He painted portraits of Hawaiian people and even held a one-person show at the Honolulu YMBA, Young Men's Buddhist Association auditorium for 3 days, November 9th to 11th, exhibiting some 50 works. The newspaper reports that the artist was intended to submit these portraits of Hawaiians to the Imperial Academy's art exhibition, Keiten in Tokyo in next year, but Kawabata's work submitted to the Imperial Japan Academy in 1936 did not show Hawaiians. The reason why he did not mention anything about his experience in Hawaii even after the war is unknown. After the outbreak of the Asia-Pacific War, Kawabata soon mobilized his painterly skill to produce the state-sponsored Sakusen Kirokuga, campaign record pictures, often simply called Sensoga, war pictures. In May 1942, the Navy Ministry announced it had gathered 16 to form a paintbrush corps, Saikan Butai, to document Imperial Japan's Southeast Asia campaign under the slogan, serving the nation by paintbrush, Saikan Hokoku. According to the Navy's statement, the corps would, quote, to strive to create masterpieces worthy of being handed down to future generations, telling the story of our heroic maritime efforts in pursuit of the great idea of establishing the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, end quote. Among the painters participated in the paintbrush corps was Kawabata. While the exact length of his service in this capacity is unknown, exemplary of Kawabata's work from this period, a series of 3 illustrations and short texts titled Children of Borneo, Borneo no Kodomo, printed in the Asahi newspaper between 1st to 3rd September 1942. Kawabata chose an idyllic subject matter for the Japanese occupied island, depicting boys playing football, flying kites. Kawabata also mentioned that he had seen similar scene on the island of Java and Celebes, and mother and her children bathing in the river. Ostensibly a benign subject showing no hint of Japanese colonial power, in the eye of a contemporary viewer, Kawabata's focus on defenseless Indonesian women and children may insidiously evoke the Japanese Empire's paternal dominance. Later that year, in December, Kawabata exhibited an oil painting entitled The Borneo Operation, Borneo Sakusen, at the first art exhibition for the Great East Asian War, in which he depicted Japanese troops installing mountain guns on the plains of Tarakan Island amid a violent swirl of heavy black smoke. Tarakan Island, dominated by oil field, is located to the northeast of Borneo Island. Although the painting looks quite dark, according to the short description of this work printed in the Asahi newspaper, the backdrop in Kawabata's image blazes so intensely because the Allied forces destroyed the oil facility by themselves as soon as the Japanese invaded. In 1943, Kawabata participated in the First Army Art Exhibition, the art exhibition for the complete national effort for the decisive battle, the second art exhibition for Great East Asian War, and the 7th Marine Art Exhibition. The following year, he was awarded the Asahi Newspaper Prize for his submission of Seaborne Troops Going into Actions to the Second Army Art Exhibition. Kawabata also contributed illustration to Picture Scroll of Yasukuni in 1943 and 1944, and to Picture Scroll of the Bloody Battle on Atsu Island in 1944, both of which are published by the Army Art Association. He also contributed illustration to a children's propaganda book for Little Citizens, Shokokumin. Likely as a consequence of these accomplishments, in December 1944, the Army Ministry dispatched 4 painters, Kawabata, Minami Masayoshi, Tamura Konosuke, and Yoshioka Kenji, to the Philippines to, quote, eternally document the soldiers who are fighting bravely on the battlefields of Leyte, and the sacred eagles who are fighting strenuously as suicide attack units, Tokotai, along with the intense situation of the war, end quote, reported the Yomiuri newspaper. On Leyte in the Philippines, an island which had been under Japanese occupation since the 1942 invasion, the Japanese occupying troops were eventually dismantled by the US military forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur during a battle that had been taking place since the American soldiers had landed in October 1944. Although the exact length of Kawabata's service in the Philippines are unknown, and none of the Kawabata's war paintings from the Philippines are known to exist today, there is no doubt he was in the Philippines during the Halloween conflict, which followed the landing of the US forces. Kawabata escaped from the Philippines sometime in the spring of 1945 and reported on, quote, the recent success of the Japanese in the Philippines, end quote, in Asahi newspaper on May 11th. According to Kawabata, quote, the Japanese are all living in cave dwellings in the mountainous area, cultivating various things and are splendidly self-sufficient, end quote. Furthermore, Kawabata gave his reader the following words of encouragement, quote, inferring from the good fight of the garrisons here and seeing the bright and robust fighting spirit of the Japanese, I strongly felt the conviction that the whole Japanese population of the Philippine Islands, who are fighting bravely with the infinite faith in the soundness of General Yamashita Tomoyuki, will still fight on splendidly, end quote. Although the article is said to be Kawabata's words, it was colored by conspicuous language like good to fight, zensen, fighting bravely, kanto suru, phrases that were overused in the announcement of the Imperial General Headquarters and the newspaper coverage that followed them. Under the mass psychology of fascism, Kawabata's narrative was thoroughly censored by the empire and also self-censored, demonstrating that the painter did not have his own individual voice per se during the war. Nevertheless, Kawabata's activity had a result of fomenting the will to fight in the last phase of the Second World War, when Japan's war situation was deteriorating drastically. For example, Kawabata contributed the illustration to the picture scroll of the Bloody Battle on Atsu Island, glorifying Japanese suicide attack and avoiding the subject of surrender. Kawabata also gave erroneous reports on the Japanese public that the Japanese forces had been successful in the Philippines. In this way, the artist spent the war as agent of what Yoshimi Yoshiaki has called grassroots fascism, Kusanone no fascism, by emboldening the mass culture that underpinned Emperor Hirohito, the fascist regime, and the war. After Imperial Japan's defeat and surrender, especially in 1950, Japan saw an increase in cultural exchange with other countries, and even more so in 1951, as a result of its signing of San Francisco Peace Treaty with the former Allied nations. In Tokyo, Kawabata saw the works of the post-Picasso generation of European painters such as Edouard Pignon at the Contemporary French Art Exhibition in 1951. Kawabata commented, quote, I feel that they are my respected colleagues rather than seniors. It means that they are in a place very close to me, end quote. Indeed, Kawabata's works were selected for the inaugural São Paulo Biennale in 1951 and for the Salon de Mai in Paris in 1952. Thanks to such success, Kawabata regained his ambition and confidence as an international painter at a time that also marked the end of the Allied occupation and the general reintroduction of the country into the international community. From around 1952, Kawabata explored the possibility of abstract expression. But his favored motifs of industrial products and factories gradually become fragmented. And by the time he moved to US in 1958, figurative references had disappeared altogether from Kawabata's compositions. Rhythm Brown on the right-hand side, for example, features no recognizable forms, only a variety of powerful calligraphic brush strokes that moves across the picture. In June 1958, the US became much closer to Kawabata when Rhythm Brown was selected to be exhibited at the Guggenheim International Award in 1958. The same month, the American gallerist Betty Parsons visited Kawabata, and according to Alexander Monroe, quote, her studio visit so inspired Kawabata that within a few months, he flew to New York, taking with his some 50 rolled up canvases, end quote. Thanks to the revitalization of cultural exchanges between Japan and the Allies in the 1950s, Kawabata was well aware of the American art world's new trends and abstract painters. The former war painter's surprisingly quick post-war rehabilitation owed much to the presence of the US. Significantly, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum decided to exhibit Kawabata's pieces even before he arrived in the US. After his arrival in New York in late 1958, Kawabata was soon represented by the influential gallery, the Betty Parsons Gallery. Kawabata, as discussed vis-a-vis Rhythm Brown, began to add bold calligraphic brush strokes to his painting shortly before his arrival in the US. And the works executed in similar style made up the majority of the painting featured in his first New York solo show at the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1960. From around 1963, however, the use of calligraphic brush strokes gradually faded from Kawabata's pictures to be replaced by geometric shapes and clear colors. Furthermore, Kawabata's work like Green Carp of 1967 on the right-hand side were painted with acrylics, making this shift even more striking. Kawabata's thoroughgoing exploration of color and form and his resulting new style was consistent with the trend of American painting toward what Clement Greenberg called post-painterly abstraction, and showed stylistic affinity with American painters such as Paul Freely, Ellsworth Kelly, and Jack Youngerman, who are represented by the Betty Parsons Gallery at that time. Parsons often appreciated Kawabata as a bridge builder between Asia and America. In 1969, on the occasion of Kawabata's sixth solo show at her gallery, Parsons showed appreciation of his abstraction by saying, quote, he has the spirit of the East and the power of the West. He can turn on lights no one has ever seen before, end quote. What most impressed Parsons about Kawabata's work was not his contribution to post-painted abstraction, but his ability to bridge East and West. Parsons' cliched celebration of the Asian immigrant painters as an East-West link attests to her interest and commitment to what Christina Klein calls a global imaginary of integration. After the US so-called lost China to communism in 1949, American policymakers and cultural producers put efforts into crafting various sentimental narratives of East-West friendship to win the allegiance of other Asian countries with the hope of encouraging ordinary US citizens to, US citizens to identify the people of Asia as allies in the Cold War. Although Parsons' gallery statement was not directly political, she was fully invested in the global imaginary of integration, which encouraged her to discover and introduce Japanese immigrant painters to an American audience to help them integrate it into the New York artistic community, to learn from their art and to build affective ties with them. Drawing on insights from Klein's study, I interpret the post-war American art world's burgeoning support of Japanese immigrant painter as a manifestation of their social consciousness and of their political commitments to forging a new progressive American artistic community, one that embraced cultural, racial, and national differences and integrated so-called free Asia. The following anecdotes illustrates these efforts, telling of her personal exchange of sentiment with her artists, but also draw a parallel with the larger political context of cultural exchanges. Quote, standing before Kawabata's work, as before that by Okada Kenzo, another very successful Japanese immigrant painters who are represented by Betty Parsons Gallery, and he was also a former military service painter. As before that by Okada, Betty often smiled extravagantly and nodded approval. She swayed, hugging herself or throwing her arms wide apart as if to embrace the universe. Both Okada and Kawabata responded with sinewy bows and broad smiles, with head nodding and handshakes, end quote. In this, one can read how this painter of the newly democratic Asia was adopted into American artist community, with Parsons as the de facto then mother of the new American painting. Japanese immigrant painters and the post-war American artist community shaped a mutually beneficial Trans-Pacific artistic alliance. For Americans, Kawabata's presence signified Americans' racial and cultural diversity and embodied the Cold War ideology of integration they hoped to promote. For Kawabata, the growing American interest in Asia helped them quickly secure their place in the American art world. Furthermore, it is likely that a sort of active amnesia resulting from American society's desire to integrate with non-communist Asia and Americans' fear of losing this opportunity was a key factor that enabled Kawabata to conceal his previous career in producing war propaganda paintings. Concurrent with the reduction of the US's presence and the commitment to Asia in the late 1960s and 70s, and as the significance of the diminished US-Asian political relationship manifested in the American cultural landscape, Kawabata's fortune in New York reflected a similar change, as his professional profiles was reduced. Nevertheless, I hope this paper has shown how Kawabata's trans-war practice belonged to significant historical moments linking the Asian Pacific American region. It may be surprising to learn that Kawabata and others among the first Japanese painters to become prominent in the post-American art world, but also active war painters. Perhaps it might be possible to see the origin of their remarkable adaptability, their early entry into the American artist community, and quick shift to abstraction in their extreme wartime experience, which gave them insights quickly and accurately into what the society of the time expected from painters, particularly in the production of propaganda. Before radically changing his style to abstraction in the post-war period, Kawabata already had the experience of recanting his previous Paris-inspired modernist style and switching to academic realism to produce propaganda painting during the war years. The trajectory of Kawabata was deeply intertwined with both the Japanese Empire and with the post-war ascendancy of America on the world stage. While his wartime lived experience as the empire's agent was directly molded by the Japanese Empire's coercive power, his post-war activity demonstrated in a more reciprocal and affiliative fashion the new Cold War culture of US-Asian integration as a key reframing of American power. Having once served Imperial Japan, which was a paternalistic empire with the Emperor Hirohito as its father, and which sought territorial expansion and conquest, Kawabata was later kind of adopted into American society. This move resonated with the expansion of US power into Asia, a project that was often figured in maternal, adoptive, and familiar terms. Just as post-war Japan was integrated into US-led capitalist so-called free world and the collective security system under the Pax Americana, Kawabata was incorporated into the US-centered international art scene as token minority while receiving various forms of support from prominent Americans after the war. Kawabata's relationship with Japan and the US during the trans-war period exemplifies within the visual field the entanglements of the Japanese Empire and the Cold War American hegemony. Thank you for listening.
Okay, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for Hoover Institution and Imingakai for having me here to present
a small and understudied Nikkei from Indonesia, from North Sulawesi, Indonesia. So the title is being in becoming Nikkei, Intergenerational Stories of Japanese Grandfathers in North Celebes after World War II. And this is a photo of Japanese surrender barge in 10 September 1945 in Ambon near North Sulawesi. The outline of this presentation will be divided into three, but allow me to just go quick in part one, so I can go to part two for the intergenerational stories and part three for the discussions. In a nutshell, this study explores how the third generation Nikkei Manadonis living in Owari, Japan, retell stories about their Japanese grandfathers through which they perceive, negotiate, and transform the meanings of Nikkei identity along with their migration journey to Owari. So this map shows where North Sulawesi is and also Owari. This research is part of my dissertation published in 2022. So it was spanning 3 years. But in this paper, I just used like 5 participants from group 1, which is third generation, and the spouses. Because this study is trying to map out the transformation and dynamic change of Nikkei identity, it covers 3 periodical years. It highlights the key events in Owari, which also influence the social dynamics of migration in Owari. For example, like Immigration Act reform in 1990, the mass arrest security measure after 9/11, and like the timeframe 3, the amendment of Immigration Act. So it will be covered in my presentation today. So first of all, I want to show you like the regions with significant population of Nikkei. You can see Brazil, United States, Canada, and you cannot find Indonesia there, because they have been invisible in many statistics and even discourses because they are unrecorded, and because during the colonization period, it's 1945 to 1949, for example, like foreign family names had to be changed to local names. So for example, none of my participants have Japanese family names. And so I have to, it's the typo, it's the Dutch is in this is 1815 to 1942, it's former Indonesia. So during the occupation, Java and Sumatra were under the control of the Japanese army, while the eastern regions, including Celebes, it was administered by the Navy. And most of the Japanese immigrants or diaspora, they live in Java and Sumatra. So even though they are less, like it's unrecorded, but in Owari, Japan, they are made up the highest population in Owari, like Indonesian migrants. Among the other migrants, they are the highest. It's because why there are many in Owari? Because Japanese broker owning factories in Owari came to North Sulawesi in late 1990s to find labor sources for Owari industry, brought family registry, the koseki of the Japanese ancestors who registered their descent in North Sulawesi. So despite the less or the lack of information in Indonesian side, in Japanese side, the data is rigorous that a Japanese broker could find Japanese descendants in North Sulawesi when the descendants themselves cannot or do not possess any evidence of kinship. And even in Indonesia itself, the Japanese descendants from the colonial backgrounds is not widely known. So who are they? They are orang Manado keturunan Jepang. This is self-collective identification. So I use the term Nikkei Manadonis based on their self-identification. So Manadonis itself is collective identity for all ethnic groups in North Sulawesi. And in Owari itself, when referred as by migrants in Owari as Kampung Manado due to the significant number of Manadonis residents living there. So you can see the pictures of the church and also Indonesian restaurant. And in Owari itself, there are 7 Manadonis churches. And so the history of Japanese diaspora, it's in fragments from some researchers. It is started from the Katsuobushi production Meiji period. And in 1920s, fishermen from Okinawa started sailing and living in the northern tip of Celebes. And I also find some of the evidence in the Hoji Simbong digital collection. And those who were engaged particularly in the fishing industry acted as forerunners of Japanese expansionism and as auxiliaries to the Japanese Navy in some important places, like in Manado. And through their excessive espionage activities in the East Indies, the Japanese began their military action for the conquest of Southeast Asia. So what are the issues and gaps of Nikkei identity? Nikkei studies, as understandably because of the most population of Nikkei Brazilian, they have been dominated by the narratives of Nikkei Brazilian, and they're generalized to ethnic nationalities, overlooking the peculiarity of sub-ethnic cohort in a particular region, which can offer new insights into how identity is formed in smaller, less studied communities. And also the discussion has been much heightened to the racial purity and impurity. So studies on Nikkei identities need to look beyond the equation, especially those in the colonial settings with war trauma, without the presence of Japanese ancestors. So it brings me back to the question that I encountered during fieldwork when I asked them, why did you migrate to Japan? And the answer of it is, it's about who they are. And they know how to draw the family trees of their Japanese ancestors. And how do they know this? From stories. That's why I focus on the intergenerational stories. And I was inspired by Stuart Hall's idea that identity is a matter of becoming as well as being, and it's become the title of this presentation, that it reflects the dynamic nature, agency, multiplicity, dialogic process, and the complex interplay beyond simple equation and definition of identities. And I also, but because the idea is not conceptualized, so which conceptualize it into a dialogue route to identity work, which uses narrative approach and also some stimuli and responses, for example, like the emotional responses and sense of connectedness. And in the storytelling families, I use the Fifus and Merrill, which describe 3 ways of which storytelling manifests in families. I will show you like in case of Filipino Nikkei cases, because there are like at least 2 studies by Vlog and Mabunai. It shows that the shared experience between Issei and Nisei is still existed, and then they could tell the stories to Sansei and Yonsei even though none of them experienced it. And I will show you later how about the Nikkei Manadonis case. And intergenerational story is not only about transmitting information, but it's also they can also pass on some trauma-related emotions and also feeling of guilt, anger, and grief. And some of the gaps in the intergenerational story in Nikkei identity studies are they focus more on the 2nd generation, but there remains a gap understanding the emotional impact of these narratives on the 3rd generation. So the key questions are what and how are intergenerational stories of Japanese grandfathers shared by the 3rd generation Nikkei Manadonis, and what role do these stories play in the reconstruction of Nikkei identity across 3 time frames, and how they are evolved during the 3 time periods. The main arguments, intergenerational stories are crucial in shaping how the generation descendants perceive, negotiate, and redefine Nikkei identity. And Nikkei identity extends beyond merely being Japanese or blending to ethnic nationals. It also involves in the becoming process through which descendants come to identify as Nikkei. It's shaped by intergenerational stories, emotional bonds, and interaction with others. Yeah, skip this. The study participants, there are, as I mentioned before, there are 5, and all of them are female. The age are 40s, and these are the occupation. And I want to just show you the interesting notes, because all the interviews, they're conducted in places that they are comfortable with. And for example, like Rumi, she served me nasi goreng, so I was asked to eat while she was talking. And then in Indiana case, her husband is drinking beer, so the conversation could be more relaxed. So in this kind of like interview as a side, I can say that it's not easily, it's not easily for them to talk about their past without having this kind of condition that they try to control during the interview. And this is the family tree of Nikkei Manadonis. This is just for illustration. So the ones that I interviewed, they are currently in Japan. So the setting is in Japan. And these are some of the stories of Oppa Japan, is the Japanese grandfather. The participants consistently selected the subject of Japanese forebears when queried about their reasons for migrating. The starting point of their story is almost always 1945, after Japan surrendered. Like for example, this one, the war separated Oma and Oppa. Oppa belonged to the Navy the day when Japan had defeated and the Japanese were about to repatriate. Oma was in the church. When Oma returned home, the ship had left. Oma could not take the ship. Poor Oma. And then after the war, they still send letters to each other. However, her parents disliked Oma's plan to go to Japan. If Opa wished, he should come and live in Indonesia instead. It may be because her parents saw the Japanese as colonizers, but Opa is actually kind. So it is indicated that their grandparents were married and loved each other, and she also has impression that her Japanese ancestor is kind, and on the contrary to the other people think of Japanese as colonizers. And just for your information, and like these kind of narratives are rarely heard in Indonesia. So it's something that for me, it's also kind of like surprising. And there are three settings Rumi choose to describe their Japanese ancestors. First is the separation in 1945, second, the separation, and third, some years later. The story reveals that both her, the mother and the Nisei endured a painful past. The mother carried a heavy burden on raising her children after the war, which ultimately led her to remarry. And another one is Miki. Miki got a book from a writer, Japanese writer. She opened a page marked with a torn up old Indonesian calendar sheet. This is my oppa. I heard he is someone who has high position in the Navy, maybe a general, or she meant net admiral. I don't know, but he's an influential one. The book had another bookmark and she opened it. And this is my father. He was interviewed and appeared in a Japanese newspaper too. This is the picture. Miki can barely read the Japanese words in the book. Hence, the bookmarks come in handy every time she needs to open and narrate her Japanese identity. The historical writing published in Japanese by the Japanese author exemplifies how her Japanese identity is narrated and co-constructed with others, becoming the product of the construction of historical discourse, shaped by her parents, ancestors, and researchers. It's also similar to what Sims mentioned about the combination of writing one story being written by others in terms of identity. So, okay, so what I found interesting is from all of their stories, the during occupation period is excluded or missing. So they started only after 1945, shortly after 1945, and years after 1945. And different to Filipino Nikkei, that Issei and Nisei, they still could have shared experience. In the case of Nikkei Manadanese, it's most of them, they just started from, the separation was from the Issei and the wife of Issei. That's why the stories transmitted to the other generations, their lack of details and quite patchy. So the key points, because of their minimum or no direct contact with Japanese ancestors, Nikkei identities are only inherited through stories passed by their parents. Nikkei Manadanese provides an unexplored positive or neutral views of early Japanese diaspora as family, which is grandfathers, rather than occupiers or bad guys. In Miki's case, her response is rather disconnected with her father's pride of Japan. And the third generation conveyed emotion of grief and guilt through the repeated stories they heard from the second generation that they want to come to Japan for their parents. I wanted to look for Opa's grave for Papa, and I wanted to come to Japan someday because of my sympathy and grief for my father's past experience. So due to these stories, they felt compelled to shoulder the trauma of the Nisei generation, sacrificing their personal choices, careers, and futures and families to travel to Japan through a broker. This is also confirmed by Diana and also her husband. Like we didn't want to go, but because Diana's father liked Japan so much, he wanted to go. So the Japanese grandfather and his family in Japan had a particular term before permitting the third generation of Nikkei Manadanese to come to Japan. They must come to Japan only to work, not to ask for any financial endowment and inheritance from the Japanese family. And all of them, they had to sign this kind of letter. So the key points, most participants did not migrate due to the economic hardship. Instead, they were influenced by the broker's persuasion and a sense of emotional responsibility toward their parents, the second generation. Their motivation to leave for Japan has been emotionally ingrained as deep traces through stories they heard and emotions evoked about Japan and their ancestors over time. Because of the stories, they bear responsibility of the intergenerational trauma of their parents and put aside their personal choices to leave for Japan. And then once they arrived in Japan, they have to, because they come to Japan with a deliberate choice to work and live, and everything had been arranged. They found that life and work in Orai were vastly different from the idealized Japan depicted by their parents' stories. And one of the reasons they tried to survive was because of Papa, because they don't want to disappoint their parents. And for the Kaisha owners, this Nikkei status is kankinai. It's also confirmed by Miki. It means that it's not inherently related to any special entitlement. It does not grant them privileges or special treatment in the Kaisha or the society. That's what they learned for the first time about their Japanese identity. However, the undocumented workers began to learn if they married a Japanese descendant, they could secure a valid visa to live and work in Japan for an indefinite time. Nikkei's presence was like blooming flowers, which many bees tried to take the honey. And it's also confirmed by Dina that Nikkei girls were like blooming flowers at that time we were competed for. And because of the perpetual projections by the non-Nikkei migrants, they begin to feel that their being Nikkei is a privilege among the non-Nikkei migrants. This luxury and distinction are considered more potent than economic drive, and even they left their newborns behind in North Sulawesi to keep their visa status valid. One of the participants even said, like, when I asked, why did you leave your newborn baby for the visa? And she just said, Sinjira Renai. Because a visa is a luxury here as we are descendants and we can extend our visa forever as long as we maintain good behavior. So the key points from smelly fish to blooming flowers, the initial experience of migration to Japan was inconceivable as they were forced to undertake dirty jobs involving smelly fish, tasks they had avoided in their homeland. This reality contradicted the idealized depiction of Japan provided by their parents. The encounter with undocumented migrants shifted their perspective. They began to view Nikkei identity as synonymous with legal status, a privileged position that other migrants envied. The analogy of blooming flowers came to symbolize the transformative power of rebirth and renewal. So over time, they have emerged as the most dominant sub-ethnic group in Oarai compared to other migrants. The influx of non-Nikkei migrants such as Kansuse and Naming further reinforces the perception of Nikkei luxury and distinctiveness. The continuity of their Nikkei identity is deemed so crucial that even newborn care arrangement can be adjusted to maintain the validity of their Nikkei status. So this is a brief about the transformation of meanings of Nikkei identity. Before migration, Nikkei identity is inherited by Nisei through stories repeated over time. It provides positive and neutral views to Japanese diaspora. And in 2008, a journey for Papa due to their emotional obligation for the trauma and grief of their parents, and find out that in Japan, Nikkei is kankinai for Japanese people, but they're also envied by overstayers who view them as competitors. And in the last period, it's when I conducted the study. After the mass arrest of the undocumented workers, they become the senior workers with more power and distinction among other workers with other visa, and they dominate the workspace and become the most trusted persons in Kaisha. So Nikkei identity is attached to visa and status, which carries luxury and distinction, and the journey is now no longer only a journey for Papa, but now for themselves and their next generation. So being and becoming Nikkei for the third generation of Nikkei Manadanis, being Nikkei was once only identity inherited through their parents' stories, anecdotes about past, and Japanese ancestor is viewed as a reference symbolized by grandfathers they admire rather than as former occupiers. The initial drive for migration was not motivated by long-term financial gain, but rather by a deep sense of guilt, grief, and emotional obligation to their parents. Due to the constant perception and projection from non-Nikkei migrants, Nikkei Manadanis began to view their Nikkeiness as a unique and desirable identity, one that others admired and aspired to. And the risk they took to preserve their Nikkei status underscore the profound importance they place on maintaining the continuity of their identity for themselves and future generations. As concluding remarks, Nikkei identity is shaped not only by their heritage as descendants of Japanese ancestry, but also the ways they evolve through narratives of ancestors and the others as a dialogic process of self-othering they navigate throughout their lives. The intergenerational story is crucial in identity work and provide another lens to study Nikkei identity. In this study, it constitutes the foundational fabric of Nikkei Manadanis identity. It's important to examine the emotions that the stories carry and the ways the continuity of Nikkei identity is preserved through their own interpretation and choices. A study of Nikkei Manadanis in Oarai is a preliminary attempt to revisit Nikkei identity and look beyond the hyphens of the Japanese descendants, especially from Indonesia. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was told we must leave this room at 5 p.m. sharp. So your cooperation and understanding are much appreciated. First, Professor Alice Chen of Japanese Art and Architecture at Boston University will join us online and comment on Nakamura paper. Then I will comment on two others. So,
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
yes.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. And I'll try to speak within 5 to 7 minutes. So thank you very much for including me and letting me serve as discussant. The 3 papers are wonderful, and I'll only comment on the second paper on art history. So introducing myself again, I'm Alice, and I'm a professor of history of art and architecture at Boston University, and my specialization is the modern period, both art and architecture and visual culture. So this paper by Kimihiko was very enlightening. It was wonderful to read, and I learned a lot from it. So I'll keep my comments to basically 3 scales. I see this as I love to kind of talk about at the personal level for the artist, the national level, and the international level. Looking at this interesting artist who had an active career from the 1920s to the 1960s, as the paper showed us. And obviously the main kind of presentation here, Kimihiko is showing us how could one person in those 4 decades have such huge shifts, right, in the artistic style, the subject matter, even the different genres of painting, and sometimes line drawing, the ways that he was painting at the end with abstract expressionism versus the realism of a different time earlier. So that's kind of like the setup of the situation. Like, how common is this for one person in 4 decades to change so much? And also for the context of this panel, what's also fascinating is he moved around. He was in Japan, he went to Paris, he came back to Japan, he went to Hawaii, there was Southeast Asia, and then finally USA. So again, how common would this kind of movement be for a person of this time who was an artist? So that's kind of the main points that I want to think about. So first, at the personal level for this artist, these are very dramatic shifts. I agree. But at the same time, we also want to put this in the context of, for an artist of this time in the 20th century, is that very strange in terms of someone who has changes in their artistic style? For those of you who are not art historians, I'm sure you heard of Picasso. I mean, he's someone who had a very long career. His life also spanned, pre-war, wartime, and post-war. If you look him up quickly, even on Wikipedia, you'll know he had different phases of his artistic life and styles. So kind of to put in the context, artists changing styles, maybe not this dramatic, obviously, but artists kind of progressing, changing, shifting, it's actually not very, very odd. But to be fair to, this paper, definitely the extreme changes that we see in Kawabata's career, that's what we really should kind of focus on. It's not just kind of an insular personal change, but that kind of responding to his context. But we also want to think about, were these really not natural progressions for this artist Kawabata? Is there a suggestion that he was being opportunistic? He changes, he's a chameleon, he changes depending on what's asked of him. So that's kind of more of what I would love to see in this paper in maybe a longer form. Is there that kind of thought, this is unnatural, but can we pinpoint what is the opportunism that has occurred for these shifts? So that leads me to the second level of the national level. We would know our answer probably much more if we look at him as one person in a generation. There were a lot of artists, architects, designers that also lived through the same pre-war, wartime, post-war. How unique was Kawabata in making those very dramatic changes, from kind of like post-impressionism to the realism and then abstract impressionism. Were there other artists who also experienced the same shifts in context and responded the same way? So I would be curious to hear about that, especially that very, I guess, what we find more troubling phase when he became an artist for the empire and was going out there recording kind of war activities and, looking at the people in the kind of the Pacific. So if there are actually more details about exactly how Kawabata got involved, how did he get these assignments? Who asked him to write for the Asahi News? How did he get the frontline assignments to go out there and do the war paintings? And to understand, why was he a group of these four? How were they chosen? Was it through his personal connections, his professional connections? Was it because of his existing reputation as a professional that he was asked to do this? Or, I mean, God forbid, but it probably could be possible. Did he have a personal interest? Did he want to go out there? I think we have this bias that we think artists have to be left-leaning. That's not necessarily true. There are people too, they have their own politics, right? And so, we can't just assume because somebody is an artist that they don't have sympathies for a certain kind of politics, that they might be right-leaning. And just looking at the fact that he comes from a very elite family of artistic lineage, it's probably quite possible that they have, strong connections to people who serve in the government or people who are part of the establishment who would give him that kind of personal connections to take on this kind of assignment, to be kind of like a very pro-imperial, pro-empire type of work. These are just my guesses, but based on kind of what I know of other artists and architects of this time. I mean, other people very well known who made big shifts in their wartime and post-war work would be someone like architect Tange Kenzo. He did very different kinds of work during war versus post-war. To some extent, Domon Ken, the photographer, same thing. Wartime versus post-war would be quite different. So that I would love to see, kind of this comparison of Kawabata to the others. And very quickly, the final point is the international context. I love the way the paper actually talked about not just the Japanese and American empires, but a tiny bit in the beginning was really about the French Empire, not politically speaking, but the kind of colonization, the cultural colonization of everybody else in high art at that time. You go to Paris to learn art at the kind of the greatest center of artistic making, late 19th century, early 20th century. So what I see in this paper is the way Kimihiko really kind of questioned the position of Kawabata as an artist. He first went to Paris, kind of like an inferior, like someone from the colonies to go to the metropole to learn at the feet of the masters in Paris. But then when he's assigned by Japanese empire to go over in the Pacific to kind of record, let's say, the natives of these various places out there, he now becomes kind of a dominant. He's almost like an anthropologist, right? Kind of recording. He's not there to learn. He's there to record and kind of look at them as if they were a specimen. And then the final switch in his position when he's in post-war going to the US, I would argue he's neither an inferior nor a superior in the US in post-war. He becomes this kind of interesting other, right? He positions himself as different. Like somehow in this paper, we see that he finds his traditional side. He's finding his Asianness, which those of you who look at the slide versus what he's saying will say, what does that mean when his art at that time doesn't even appear very Japanesey, right? So the work itself is very much abstract expressionism. There doesn't seem to be any nationality in the art itself, but it's the way he's describing himself that kind of really brings out that sense of kind of his position as someone unique and different. So I'll stop there, but I found this paper fascinating and thank you very much. Not just this paper, but all three papers. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Professor Chen. Nakamura-san, would you like to
Yes.
sound the question?
Thank you very much, Professor Tan, for the amazing comments. And then there was a lot, so I might cannot respond to everything. But so start from the first one. Sorry, not the start one. You mentioned like artists changing the styles, and then that's quite normal and obvious. So why it's why you argue why I argue Kawabata is special, because for example, compare with Germany, like artists who collaborated with the Nazi state, they don't have post-war stories. But Japan's case, many painters collaborated with the state, and then they continue to be the continue to have a powerful status in the art establishment. And then even some, like Kawabata's case, some of them even emigrated to the US and they become international painter. That's this Japan's case was very unusual in international art scene. I found it very fascinating case. So that's why I focus on Kawabata, and why mention it was very specific case. And then also, and you mentioned, so you mentioned like a Tange Kenzo, and then like a designer, and then architects might also have a wartime and after war career. Is it connecting with Kawabata's activities? And then, yes, I actually, for example, Tange Kenzo's case, he did like kind of propagandistic like Lisa Yoneyama-san also researching like the Tange did the war propaganda architecture, but after the war he made a memorial for the Hiroshima museum, and then this type of drastic change often happens in Japanese artists. So of course, in my dissertation, not only Kawabata, I focus on 4 artists who draw exactly the same trajectory, who produced war propaganda paintings and then become switched to international abstract painter. So it was not the, in Japanese context, Kawabata was not the exceptional case at all. And not only painter, architect, designer, many people had continued to be successful after the war. And then, and also, and you mentioned also, like, sorry, I took a many moments. And you mentioned the Kawabata seems a little bit like a opportunistic, and is it his shift towards his change of style was natural, or more like depends on the situation? He intentionally changed, and then answer is yes, of course. To continue to be painter, he needs to be strategic, and then especially in wartime, because it's, I think, connected to another question. And because in wartime, if oil painter, if you didn't collaborate it with the military authority and didn't do war propaganda paintings, you will not be rationed the canvases, painting materials. Basically, you can't work as a painter if you didn't collaborate. So there were some exceptional cases, completely quit painting because they don't want to paint propaganda, but many painters, because they want to continue to work, so needed to change the style and then collaborate. I think I should stop now. Sorry.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Nakamura-san. Okay, so if I may, I'd like to comment on 2 other presenters and 1 question each. Yi-Ting Chung asks whether Taiwanese migrants were considered Chinese or Japanese by the US government during World War II. Yi-Ting calls our attention to ethnicity and nationality's complex and arbitrary nature. From my experience of interviewing Kibei Nisei, I have learned that some regained the US citizenship without any problem, while others remained stateless for some time after the war. I say this because there are some commonalities between the two groups in a way that they were caught in between in terms of their nationality and identity. Nationality is, in fact, not necessarily set in stone, but interpreted differently depending on the environment in which it is achieved. In any case, Yi-Ting has presented us an eye-opening issue that has yet to be discussed and investigated. What is most interesting, intriguing, was that the US government, be it DOJ or INS, didn't pay much attention to the legal status of a Chinese Formosan with Japanese nationality before or during the war period. Only after Reverend Ai-Chin Tsai asked questions about his status did they decide he was a Japanese national, an enemy alien, although ethnically he was deemed Chinese. My question concerns their second research question. How did they identify themselves and what was their legal status in wartime US, especially the first part of this research question, because of Ai-Chin Tsai's education in Japan for 8 years, from high school to college, his marriage to a Japanese woman, and his involvement in the Japanese Christian community in Chicago. Is it possible, by any chance, to assume that his identity fluctuated between Japanese and Taiwanese? Does your investigation of his diary and letters reveal anything about his identity issue? That's my question to you. Next, Medium Mutiara depicts intergenerational narratives, Japanese who resided in North Sulawesi, Indonesia, after World War II. This significant study sheds light on a little-known aspect of Japanese diasporas and their descendants by conducting historical research, extensive interviews, participant observations, and questionnaire data collection. The study also led us to an ongoing issue of how we define Nikkei in the era of transnational, transcultural age. Although the study describes the historical background of pre-war and wartime periods, it emphasizes how the younger generation transformed their identity as Nikkei after initiating the work in Owarai, Ibaraki Prefecture. It was intriguing to know that Mutiara's analysis focuses not only on being a Nikkei, but more on becoming a Nikkei. From Indonesia to Japan, the journey was not necessarily for economic gains, but because of their emotional responsibility to their parents. During this homebound journey, they gradually reconstructed their Nikkei identity. Rather than a journey searching for their ancestral land, they started pondering how to hand it down to the next generation by recognizing the privileges and values as Nikkei Manadonins. It is essential to conduct intergenerational studies. For example, in the US, the traumatic experiences the Japanese Americans went through during the war period prevented former internees from discussing their experiences with the younger generation, thereby detaching themselves from Japanese language as a heritage language. And yet, there is the post-war intergenerational impact on the younger generation. This de-emphasis on the Japanese language and culture resulted in accelerated loss of Japanese language and cultural practices for the sunset. from your historical overview of the Japanese diaspora in North Celebes, I assume, this is my question for you, many are of Okinawan origin, or were there any other prefecture migrants such as Wakayama, Hiroshima, Yamaguchi, and so on? I ask this question because the identity issue regarding Okinawan heritage was absent in your presentation. I presume this is because of the case you introduced in your presentation in Miki's story of Oppa Japan. For example, Oppa was in the Japanese Navy and was from Kagoshima. If you could tell us a different story about an Okinawan Manadonese, it'll be interesting to know that the identity issue, not in an encompassing Nikkei category, but of a different kind, the Uchinanchu identity. So that's my question. So please.
How much time? Okay, okay. Thank you, Professor Morimoto, for the question, because I didn't have time to address the issue of self-identification in the presentation. So I agree with your observation. I think Yi-Ting, although in his petition letters to repeal his status as enemy alien, he repeatedly said that, clarified he's not a Japanese subject. And he repeatedly said that, well, the history of Taiwan, 80%, the majority were Han Chinese, or were actually Chinese. However, it's difficult for me to imagine that he did not identify with the Japanese community, consider how close he was with the Japanese Christian community. And from the corresponding letters he had with those Japanese Christian leaders as well, even in the post-war era, they remain a good relationship. And actually in the post-war, Yi-Ting moved together with Liu Tsai to Seattle, and he continued to serve in the Japanese Christian church. So he would continue to be a Taiwanese pastor speaking Japanese in the post-war era. So it's hard for me to consider that at that point, he did not consider himself as Japanese. And also when he was negotiating with the Chicago police and with the Fourth Presbyterian Church, which was a Caucasian church at the time, he was always acting on behalf of the Japanese community. So he's not helping out the Japanese community as an outsider. And the atmosphere that I get was he was helping the Japanese community as part of them. So I entirely agree with you. I think there is definitely that part of it. But also I need to note that immediately after Cairo Declaration, he wrote to the Chinese consulate in US declaring that he wanted Chinese citizenship and repeal his Japanese citizenship. So it remains an interesting question to me that while his brother-in-law, Kevin Chung, decided to naturalize to US citizenship, why didn't Yi-Ting naturalize to US citizenship? It seems like it wasn't an option, and he selected a route of instead trying to naturalize to Chinese citizenship even before the war ended. And he actually tried, at some point he was writing that he wanted to seek some connections to see if he can work in the US consulate in Taiwan in the post-war period. So it seems to me, at least during that period, he's also thinking about his identity as Chinese as well. And last is the Taiwanese component. So of course, he's also aware of the Taiwanese part, Formosan part of his identity. For in the post-war era, he was actually part of the US bomb survey team that was sent to Japan to survey the destructive power of atomic bomb and firebombing. So during that trip, he actually got in contact with the Taiwanese communities in Japan and realized that they were actually both abandoned by the Japanese government and the ROC government. So due to the lack of resources, he actually appealed to the US government asking, can I find out a way to help the Taiwanese community there? So it seems like he still has a very strong identification with Taiwanese identity. And he actually became the first president of the Taiwanese Association in Seattle in post-war period as well. So you can see he's straddling between two worlds, even in the post-war era, between the Japanese Christian community and the Taiwanese association community. So it's kind of me saying that I think his case really demonstrated how identity making is a messy and fluid process. So kind of echoing what Median's presentation was talking about identity as both becoming and being. So I think we can see the same case here, that being Formosan really meant different things in different historical period. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Morimoto, for the comments and also the question. So first of all, most of them know about the origin of their Japanese ancestors from Japanese broker and researchers. So the Japanese broker bringing the Koseki to North Sulawesi out of the blue was like a game changer. It's like connecting the dots between the stories, the static stories or the memories to the reality that, oh, so actually I'm a real Japanese descendant. So that's why there is a lack of depth about the Okinawan heritage, unfortunately. And I can assure this because I have the comparison of an interview with Nikkei from Java, who has Japanese ancestor who stayed, becoming the holdout of Japanese soldier. And he still has some memorabilia from his grandparents, like some katana or something like that, but not for the Nikkei Manadonis. They don't have things like that. There is a sign. So maybe that's all. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, we can make it. It's already 5 past. Oh, my time is 5 sharp. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody.